forgotten pages, is a quiet journey into moments history almost lost. These stories are told as depictions of historical events, seen through the eyes of someone who lived them. Each one is calm, atmospheric, and thoughtfully told. Let this story guide you into another time and give your mind something gentle to follow. Relax, settle in, and let the story unfold. 2 weeks before Vesuvius tore itself open, the vines were doing well. That was what mattered to me then. The rose above my house had finally settled after the spring tremors. The soil held, the leaves were full. The grapes were still small, tight, not ready yet, but healthy. I walked the vineyard every morning before the sun climbed too high, checking the posts, brushing ash from the leaves without thinking much of it. There was always ash now, fine, pale. It settled everywhere. My wine shop opened onto the street of abundance, not far from the forum. Travelers passed through daily, merchants from Nuceria, sailors coming up from the harbor at Pompeii's edge. They drank, complained, laughed, argued about prices, argued about Rome. Life sounded normal when the door was open. The ground had been restless for years. Everyone knew that. The earthquake, 17 years earlier, had cracked half the city open. Some houses never fully recovered. Others had been rebuilt better than before. Fresh plaster still covered walls near the Temple of Apollo. Scaffolding stood around parts of the forum. Construction never really stopped. We were used to it. Some mornings, the wine jars rattled on their shelves. Just a soft clink, enough to notice, not enough to stop pouring. I kept amphorae stacked in the back room, sealed and marked. Falernian blends sold best, but my own vineyard wine paid the bills. Locals trusted it. They had for years. I liked that. Familiar faces mattered more than coin. 2 days before the game's honoring Vulcan, a tremor ran through the street while I was weighing out a jug for a customer. The ground shifted sideways, quick and sharp. The man laughed and steadied himself on the counter. "Vulcan's awake," he said. I smiled and finished the pour. Outside, Mount Vesuvius looked the same as it always had. Green, quiet, vineyards climbing its lower slopes. No smoke, no fire, just another mountain watching over the Bay of Naples. At night, I could smell sulfur sometimes, faint, easy to dismiss. The harbor always smelled of something: fish, pitch, rotting rope. People still came to the baths. The suburban baths stayed busy. The brothels stayed busy. The bakeries ran hot. Bread ovens burned day and night. Life didn't slow down. If anything, it felt crowded. One afternoon, ash fell thick enough to notice on the tables outside my shop. I wiped it away with my sleeve and kept going. No one mentioned it. No one wanted to. I remember thinking the harvest might come early that year. I remember thinking I should buy more jars. Business stayed steady. Most days followed the same shape. I opened the shutters early, swept the ash from the threshold, checked the jars. The vineyard work came first, then the shop. If I skipped the vines for even a day, I felt it. The posts leaned, the leaves curled, things slipped quietly when you weren't looking. I walked up toward the slopes often, past other vineyards, past small shrines tucked into the stone. Farmers talked while they worked, about yields, about repairs, about the tremors. Always the tremors. No one sounded afraid. Annoyed, maybe. Tired of rebuilding the same walls. From the higher ground, you could see the bay clearly. The water stayed calm. Ships moved in and out of the harbor below. The smell of tar and salt drifted up when the wind shifted. Nothing about the view suggested trouble. Back in town, repairs continued everywhere. Near the Forum, masons chipped away at old cracks and laid fresh stone. Paintings were being redone inside homes along the street of the theaters. Bright reds, deep blacks, new gods painted over old scars. I sold wine to the workers more often than travelers. They drank fast, cheap cups, long breaks in the shade. They talked about wages and shortages, about rumors from Rome, about games coming soon. Vulcan's festival brought people out even when the ground shook. One afternoon, I walked past the Temple of Isis on my way back from the baths. It had been rebuilt completely after the earthquake years ago. Stronger than before, people still left offerings there, small ones, coins, fruit. The priests kept the steps clean. Faith adapted faster than stone. That same day, the tremors came again. Not sharp, not sudden, just a rolling movement, slow enough to notice before it passed. The pigeons scattered from the rooftops. Somewhere nearby, pottery shattered. No one ran. A woman cursed. A child laughed. Someone shouted a joke about Neptune losing his footing. I went back to the shop and checked the shelves. 2 jars had shifted. Nothing broke. At night, the vineyard sounded different. The insects were louder. The air felt heavier. The smell from the mountain carried farther. Sulfur again. Not strong, just present. I slept lightly, waking once or twice without knowing why. A few days later, a friend from Herculaneum stopped by. He traded olive oil for wine when he could. He said their springs had grown warmer. The water tasted wrong in places. He shrugged when he said it. Springs changed. Everyone knew that. I poured him a cup anyway. Down by the harbor, fishermen complained about dead fish washing up closer to shore. Not many, just enough to notice. They blamed the heat. The summer had been dry. The sun punished anyone who stayed out too long. The suburban baths stayed open, but some pools cooled unevenly. Hot where they shouldn't be, cold where they used to steam. The attendants adjusted valves and pretended it was fine. I spent more time in the vineyard after that. The soil felt different underfoot, firmer in places, loose in others. Small cracks opened between the rows, narrow enough to ignore if you weren't looking for them. I started marking jars more carefully. I counted my stock twice. I bought extra stoppers, extra oil for sealing. I didn't know why. It felt practical. One evening, ash fell thick enough to coat the leaves again. I brushed it away and noticed how it clung to my skin. Fine, almost soft. It collected in the folds of my sleeves and along my collar. From the street, I could hear music drifting from a nearby house. Laughter followed. Someone had money. Someone always did. Later, after closing, I walked toward the Forum. Torches burned along the way. The stones still held the day's heat. I stood near the temple of Jupiter and looked south, past the rooftops, toward the mountain. Vesuvius sat there, dark against the sky. No glow, no smoke. Just quiet. I told myself the harvest would come soon. I told myself I had time. The days slid together after that. I measured them by the work, by how many jars moved, by how often the ground reminded us it was there. Some mornings passed cleanly, others carried a faint sway, enough to make the cups on the counter tremble. People still argued about prices. They still complained about Rome, about taxes, about repairs that never seemed to finish. The city sounded alive, busy, full. If you listened long enough, you could convince yourself nothing had changed. I went to the baths less often. The water there made me uneasy. It was hard to say why. The temperature shifted without warning. Steam rose where it hadn't before. I preferred the stream near the Vineyard now. It stayed cold, clear. One afternoon, while working the rows, I felt the tremor before I heard it. A deep movement underfoot, slow, rolling. The posts rattled in their sockets. The leaves shook loose ash into the air. I stayed where I was and waited. It passed. From the slope, I could see other farmers doing the same thing, hands resting on tools, heads tilted, listening for what came next. When nothing did, everyone went back to work. We were good at that. In town, repairs continued. Near the House of the Faun, a wall had collapsed again. The owner swore loudly while men cleared the stones. Someone painted over fresh cracks inside another home. Bright colors meant to distract the eye. Red covered a lot of things in Pompeii. I sold more wine to locals than travelers that week. Ships still came in, but fewer stayed long. Sailors drank quickly and moved on. Some spoke of strange weather farther along the coast. Others said nothing at all. One evening, ash fell again. Not thick, just enough to dull the light. I wiped the counter twice before closing and still found grit between my fingers. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake listening to the city breathe. Footsteps, distant laughter, dogs barking somewhere near the gate. Under it all, a low sound I couldn't place. Not quite a tremor, not quite silence. The next morning, a runner passed through the street shouting news. Repairs delayed again near the Forum. More damage uncovered beneath old stone. No one seemed surprised. I walked to the market and bought more grain than usual. More oil. I told myself it was for trade, for the shop, for the vineyard hands. I didn't like how fast my supplies disappeared once I started counting them. A few days later, during Vulcan's festival, the fires burned bright across the city. Offerings smoked, people drank. The laughter sounded louder than it needed to be. I stood near my doorway and watched the crowd move past, cups in hand, faces flushed from heat and wine. Someone slapped my shoulder and thanked me for a good pour. Another joked about Vulcan testing his strength beneath our feet. I smiled when expected. That night, the tremors came again. Short, sharp, enough to wake me. Dust fell from the ceiling beams. I sat up and waited for the second one. It came, smaller than the first. Then nothing. The days after that felt heavier. The air pressed down. The smell from the mountain lingered longer in the evenings. Sulfur again, always faint, always easy to dismiss. A friend from Starbier passed through and said the wells there had dropped suddenly. Another mentioned livestock acting strangely outside the walls. I nodded and poured wine and changed the subject. At the vineyard, small cracks widened between the rows. I filled them where I could, packed soil back into place. The ground accepted it without complaint. In town, fish sellers complained again. More dead fish near the shore, still not many, still not enough to cause alarm. The harbour stayed busy. I started closing the shop earlier. Not by much, just enough to finish the day, while the light still held. I spent evenings sitting outside, watching the sky fade. The colours stayed rich. Reds and golds stretched longer than they used to. Or maybe I just noticed them more. One night, I heard a distant rumble that didn't fade. It rolled beneath the city and settled into my bones. I stood in the doorway until it stopped. No one came running. The next morning, I marked every jar again, counted them twice. I stacked supplies closer to the door. I moved nothing heavy, but I noticed where everything was. The vineyard was quiet that day. Too quiet. Even the insects seemed subdued. The leaves hung still. The air felt thick against my skin. From the slope, Vesuvius looked unchanged. Green, solid, patient. I worked until my hands ached and then went back into town. The streets were full. The city carried on. I told myself the harvest would be soon. I told myself I would be ready. The city felt smaller as the days passed. Not quieter, just closer. Sounds carried farther. Voices echoed longer between the walls. Even in the early morning, before the streets filled, Pompeii never fully slept anymore. I spent more time inside the shop. The sun felt harsher when it climbed, pressing down on the street stones until the air shimmered. Customers lingered less. They drank, paid, and moved on. Fewer jokes, shorter conversations. The tremors came and went. Some days brought none at all. Others carried one sharp movement that rattled the shelves just enough to make me pause. I learned which jars needed extra padding and which corners of the shop creaked first. I stopped rearranging things. Everything had a place now. In the vineyard, the grapes swelled faster than expected. The leaves curled inward during the hottest hours. I watered more often, though the soil resisted in strange ways. Some patches drank deeply. Others shed the water as if they didn't want it. Neighbors noticed too. We talked while working, voices low, eyes on the ground. No one named the feeling directly. We circled it instead. Weather, soil, bad luck, the mountain. Vesuvius watched. From the slopes, I could see smoke from hearths rise across the city. Thin columns, steady and calm. The harbour stayed active, though ships loaded faster now. Sailors argued less and listened more. One afternoon, I walked through the forum and counted how many buildings still wore scaffolding. More than before. Fresh plaster hid new cracks. Paint disguised rough repairs. The city had learned how to cover wounds quickly. At the Temple of Apollo, A small crowd gathered. Offerings burned. Incense drifted across the steps. I didn't stop long. The air there felt heavy, trapped between stone and heat. I passed the bakery near my shop and noticed how the ovens ran hotter than usual. The baker cursed as he pulled loaves early, sweat pouring down his face. He blamed the fuel. He always blamed the fuel. That evening, ash fell again, enough to coat the street in a thin grey layer. Children traced shapes in it with their feet. Adults swept it aside and complained about the mess. I closed the shutters earlier than usual and sat inside with a cup of my own wine. It tasted the same. Familiar, reliable. I let that comfort settle. Outside, the city carried on. Later, as the light faded, a tremor rolled through. Longer than most. Not violent, just persistent. I stayed seated and waited for it to pass. When it did, I finished my drink and stood. The walk home felt longer that night. The stones underfoot still held warmth, but the air had cooled unevenly. I passed familiar doorways, familiar lamps, familiar voices drifting through open windows. At home, I set my tools in their places. I washed my hands and watched the water swirl away, carrying fine grey dust with it. I ate simply: bread, oil, a little cheese. Before sleeping, I stepped outside and looked toward the vineyard. The rows lay dark and quiet under the sky. Beyond them, the mountain rose, its outline sharp against the fading light. Nothing moved. I went inside and lay down, listening to the city settle around me. Footsteps faded, doors closed. Somewhere, a dog barked and then stopped. Sleep came slowly, but it came. The morning came warm and still. I woke before the street did and lay there for a moment, listening. No tremor greeted me, no distant rumble, just the low sounds of the city beginning again. A door opening, footsteps on stone, someone calling out to a neighbor. I rose and dressed without hurry. At the shop, I opened the shutters and let the light in. Ash dusted the threshold again. I swept it away and checked the jars. Everything sat where I'd left it. The seals held. The markings were clear. I felt a quiet satisfaction in that. A few customers came through. Familiar faces, regular orders. We talked about the heat, about the coming harvest, about nothing important. By midday, the air pressed down hard enough that I closed early. The vineyard needed attention more than the shop did. I walked the rows slowly, checking the posts, touching the leaves, feeling the soil with my hands. The grapes were close now, heavy, promising. I worked until the light softened. In the distance, the bay shimmered. Ships moved steadily in the harbor. Smoke rose from hearths across the city. Everything looked as it should. On the walk home, I stopped once and looked back toward the mountain. It stood quiet against the sky, dark and unchanged. I held my gaze there longer than usual, then turned away. Inside, I ate simply and cleaned up after myself. I set things out for the morning, tools ready, clothes folded. The habits felt grounding. As night settled in, the city grew quieter than it had been in days. The air cooled unevenly, brushing my skin in small waves. I opened the window and let it in. I lay down and listened. Somewhere nearby, a cup clinked. A voice laughed softly and faded. The sounds thinned until only the city's breath remained. I closed my eyes, already thinking about the vines. Tomorrow would be a full day. I let sleep take me where it always did. For now, that was enough. The next few days passed without any clear edge to them. I settled into a rhythm that felt dependable. Mornings began at the Vineyard. I walked the rows while the air was still cool, checking the ties, brushing dust from the leaves, pressing the soil back into place where it had loosened overnight. My hands moved automatically. I liked that. It gave my thoughts somewhere to rest. By the time the sun climbed higher, I headed back toward town. The streets filled slowly. Shop doors opened one by one. Voices drifted out, familiar and unhurried. I opened my own shutters and let the light spill across the counter. Customers came in waves. A pair of masons stopped by mid-morning, their hands chalked white with dust. They drank quickly and talked about a wall near the forum that had cracked again overnight. Nothing serious, just another repair to add to the list. I poured, nodded, and wiped the counter after they left. Around midday, a woman from the next street brought a small jar back, asking if I could reseal it. The stopper had loosened during the night. I fixed it while she watched, twisting it into place until it held. She thanked me and stayed long enough to finish her cup. Outside, ash drifted down lightly. It settled on the stone benches and collected in the corners of doorways. Someone swept it away. Someone else complained about their sandals. Life adjusted in small ways. In the afternoon, I walked toward the baths, more out of habit than need. I didn't stay long. The air inside felt heavy, and the water steamed unevenly. I rinsed my hands and left, stepping back into the brighter light of the street with relief. I passed the forum on the way back. A crowd had gathered near one of the temples, watching workers secure loose stone along the steps. The sound of chisels rang sharply, then stopped. Dust hung in the air before settling. People lingered for a moment, then moved on. By evening, the heat eased. I closed the shop and walked home, carrying a small bundle of supplies. The street stones still held warmth beneath my sandals. Lamps flickered to life as the light faded. At home, I ate and sat quietly for a while. The city sounded distant through the walls. When sleep came, it felt shallow, broken by brief waking moments I couldn't explain. Each time, I lay still until rest returned. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The air felt different, cooler but thicker. I opened the door and stood in the street, listening. Somewhere far off, something rumbled once, low and brief. It faded before I could place it. I went about my morning anyway. At the vineyard, the grapes hung heavy now, their skins darkening faster than I expected. I cut away a few damaged leaves and adjusted the supports. The soil crumbled oddly beneath my fingers, dry on the surface, damp beneath. From the slope, I watched the city wake again. Smoke rose in thin lines. The harbor caught the early light. Everything looked steady. Back in town, business slowed. Fewer people lingered. Conversations stayed short. A man paid for his wine and left without finishing his cup. Another stood at the doorway, longer than usual, looking up the street before stepping away. In the afternoon, a tremor rolled through the city, longer than most, not strong enough to break anything, but enough to draw attention. Jars rattled. Someone shouted from outside. I waited until the movement passed, then checked the shelves. Nothing fell. That evening, ash fell again, thicker this time. I swept it away twice before giving up. It coated the threshold no matter what I did. The sky held its color longer than usual, deep reds and soft golds stretching across the horizon. I stood outside for a while, watching it fade. When I finally went inside, I set things out carefully for the next day. Tools in place, supplies counted. The small rituals helped more than I expected. I lay down and listened to the city settle once again. Doors closed, voices quieted. Somewhere nearby, water ran through a pipe or channel, steady and reassuring. Sleep came slowly, but it came. Tomorrow would bring more of the same. For now, that was enough. The next morning, I didn't go to the vineyard. I left the house early and walked toward the sea instead. The streets thinned as I moved away from the center of town. Fewer shops, fewer voices. The air shifted as the salt came through, cutting lightly against the warmth. Near the harbor, fishermen were already working. Nets lay stretched across the stone, glistening with moisture. A few men stood ankle-deep in the water, rinsing gear and talking quietly. Their voices carried differently here, softened by the open space. I walked along the edge of the shore and let the sound of the water take over. Small waves slid in and pulled back again, steady and patient. The bay looked calm. The surface reflected the sky in long, pale streaks. I found a place away from the boats and sat on the stone, close enough to feel the cool air rise off the water. I stayed there without checking the time, without counting anything, just listening. A merchant ship moved slowly across the bay, sails catching the light. Farther out, smaller boats drifted, barely moving at all. Gulls cried overhead and settled again, unbothered by the day. I watched the shoreline for a while. Bits of seaweed collected near the rocks. A few fish broke the surface briefly, then disappeared again. Everything followed its own rhythm. For the first time in days, the ground beneath me stayed still. I breathed more easily there. The air felt cleaner, lighter. The smell of salt and water replaced the heavier scent that clung to the city. I stayed until the sun climbed higher and the stones beneath me warmed. When I finally stood, I felt rested in a way that surprised me. I walked back toward town along the water, passing small shrines and storage sheds. The harbor remained busy, but the urgency I'd felt elsewhere didn't follow me there. People worked. Boats came and went. The day unfolded without comment. By the time I returned home, the streets had filled again. I opened the shop late and didn't apologize for it. A few regulars stopped by while we talked briefly. I poured carefully and took my time. That evening, I closed earlier than usual and ate at home. The sound of the sea lingered in my ears long after I lay down. The city felt farther away. Sleep came faster that night. The morning felt familiar again. I woke with the light already working its way into the room. Not bright, just enough to tell me the day had started without asking anything from me yet. I lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds outside. Someone passed in the street. A door opened, then closed. I dressed and stepped out, breathing in the cooler air before the heat returned. The city moved slowly at this hour, shops still shuttered, voices low. I walked the long way toward the vineyard, letting my pace settle on its own. The rows waited where I'd left them. The vines stood heavy now, leaves broad and dark, grapes pulling gently at their stems. I moved between them without hurry, checking what needed checking, fixing what I could. My hands knew the work. When the sun climbed higher, I headed back into town. The shop opened easily, shutters wide, light across the counter. I set out cups and jars and let the day come to me. A few people stopped in, familiar faces, quiet exchanges, nothing urgent. By midday, the air pressed down again. I closed early and went home. Inside, the walls kept the worst of the heat away. I ate simply and rinsed my cup, watching the water swirl and disappear. In the afternoon, I rested. Not sleeping, just sitting with the window open, letting the sounds of the city drift in and out. Somewhere in the distance, the harbor carried on. Somewhere closer, a voice laughed and faded. As evening approached, I stepped outside once more. The sky softened into warmer colors. The light stretched across the stones and lingered there. I watched it change without thinking about what came next. At home, I set things out for the morning. Tools where they belonged, clothes folded, small preparations that made the next day feel lighter. When night settled in, I lay down easily. The city quieted around me. The routine held. My breathing slowed without effort. Thoughts drifted and thinned until there was nothing left to follow. Tomorrow would come when it was ready. For now, I rested.